One of the most interesting figures in all of Vikings history is also one of the most reviled. There's a lot of wild stories to tell, so let's get into it. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at LukeBraunNFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Today on the show, I want to talk about probably not the most reviled person in Vikings history. That's probably Darren Sharper, but certainly one of them. One of the most hated people. Now, if you are a younger fan, or if you're not, maybe you got into football a little bit more recently, you might not know Mike Lynn by name, but you'll probably know his legacy. Because if you are even the most casual fan of football, you've heard of the Herschel Walker trade. And we will get into it, so I don't know, do what you have to do emotionally to brace yourself for that, get the incense out or whatever, because we will get into the Herschel Walker trade today. But I want to take it all the way from the beginning, and let's talk about Mike Lynn, because look, that dude made a lot of mistakes over the years, and his tenure as power-holding operator of Vikings personnel decisions was fairly catastrophic. Like, whatever good things happened to the Vikings in the 80s, pretty much all of them were Bud Grant. But Bud Grant swears by him. A lot of people who worked with him swear by him. The players didn't like him. Some of the players thought he was kind of racist. There's a lot of complexities to this figure, and I don't think you can tell the story of the Vikings without telling this. So, let me take you all the way back to 1974. A 38-year-old movie theater manager in Memphis, Tennessee, pens a letter to Max Winter. Now, this guy has built a decent life for himself. He makes a living. He's doing okay. But he has always dreamed of working for a football team. So he writes a letter to Max Winter and says, I would love to work for your football team. I'll do anything. I just want to work for a football team. And Max Winter, so impressed by the gumption and the initiative, says, all right, come on in. I'll make you my personal assistant and mentor you, and you'll kind of, and from there, Mike Lynn kind of became Max Winter's protege. By the way, if you aren't familiar, Max Winter was one of the founders and the majority owner of the Vikings all the way up through, I want to say 1988. So he was the owner of the Vikings at the time, and for a lot of, a large, almost like half of their history. So the timeline is important here. So just keep all that in mind. This was 1974. In 1975, Jim Finks, who was the general manager of the Vikings from, I want to say 64 all the way through 75. So he was the one making a lot of the transactions and draft picks and stuff that built the dynastic 70s. He steps aside, takes a job with the Bears, and it leaves the general manager position open. Now, at this time, the general manager position isn't like the most prestigious position. Bud Grant and Jim Finks worked together very well, and they sort of shared the credit for drafting Alan Page and stuff like that. But without Finks in there, it was pretty much Bud Grant's show from 75 all the way until Grant wasn't in the building anymore, or at least not as a coach. So this was a bit more of a ceremonial position. And Max Winter gives it to his protege, who had only been in the organization 1 year as Winter's personal assistant, and he says, yeah, you be GM. Which, I mean, could you imagine something like that happening today? But hey, you know, the 70s, different era, different time, different principles, right? So Mike Lynn is general manager, but again, he's in the draft rooms. Like, he's not like totally absentee, but it's Bud Grant's show all the way through, you know, things like drafting Matt Blair, Scott Studwell, stuff like that. That's all very much Bud Grant, but Bud Grant swears by Mike Lynn, says that guy was a good guy to work with. He was a bright man. You know, Bud Grant has nothing ill to say about Mike Lynn. The players bristled a lot with him in his time, but that's kind of a different thing. really one of the first times that Mike Lynn gets any real power in the organization is upon Bud Grant's first retirement. So, if you're unfamiliar, in 1983, Bud Grant hangs him up. And if you don't know the story, I'm actually not going to spoil it for you. Stick around. This one gets wild. I actually told a lot of it like a couple weeks ago. But, anyways, so Mike Lynn has the authority to name the next head coach. It is his job to name the next head coach. And so he goes to Bud Grant and he says, "Who do you think?" Well, Jerry Burns was the obvious answer. He was the offensive coordinator, and Bud Grant had very little to do with the X's and O's on those teams. He was like not a scheme guy, and he never really cared for the scheme part of it. He still says he's like, yeah, that's not what I really think the sport is about. So he delegated all that stuff to Burnsy. Burns, the Tarkenton offense, the Chuck Foreman, all those schemes that made those players so cool, that was Burnsy. So he was kind of the obvious choice. But also on that staff, Bud Grant says, well, I mean, we got Pete Carroll. He's kind of interesting. He was defensive backs coach at the time. We've got Floyd Reese. We got Mark Trestman. These kind of younger guys that a lot of them would end up getting great opportunities down the road. And Mike Lynn says, hey, what about this kid who's a wide receiver coach and special teams coordinator? That's Les Steckel. Now, again, I'm sort of overlapping with my Les Steckel episode, which was a few weeks ago. But if you missed that, go check it out. But yeah, they had a special relationship, Lynn and Steckel. Steckel was sort of I don't know. He had believed in Les Steckel a lot, and Bud Grant believed in Les Steckel too. He said, yeah, sure, I guess that's fine. He recommended a bunch of guys, but I guess this guy would be okay too. And so Les Steckel got the job. It was a catastrophe. The 1984 season was one of the worst in Vikings history, maybe the worst, even though the worst is probably their second year where they only won 2 games. It's the only time that's ever happened to them. But 3-13 has not happened to them a lot, and the circumstances surrounding this one, they had Joey Browner in the building. Like, they had superstars in that building already, and Matt Blair and Fred McNeil and stuff. And it was a total disaster. The team totally gave up. Catastrophe year, right? That is just one of the things that Mike Lynn did that he really is, I think, mostly responsible for. I mean, if you read like Bud Grant's book or ask him about it, he'll say like, oh, I don't know, I probably should have pushed for Jerry Burns more, and he'll like take some responsibility on himself. But come on, that was Mike Lynn's call, and it was obviously a terrible call. That guy was very much like clearly meant to be a position coach and like not manage people. Again, go listen to my Les Steckel episode. There's a lot more to that guy than you might know. But that didn't work out, right? Bud Grant comes out of retirement. That's the 1985 season. And by the way, after the 1985 season, the USFL folds, which means we get Keith Millard back. And that's when they get Anthony Carter and Gary Zimmerman. And like a huge influx of talent comes in that offseason. And then they give the job to Jerry Burns. And Bud Grant tells Mike Lynn, like, I'll come back and fix all this crap that you guys broke, but only if you promise that Jerry Burns is getting the job. I'm not making this mistake again. And everybody was like, yep, nope, that's fine. We're good. Yep, we're doing that. So that was kind of how that late 80s run started, where you have the 87 season, which I already talked about, but 88 and 89 were also playoff years. And kind of that peak of the Jerry Burns era starts on that foot and with Mike Lynn at the helm. I do want to talk about all this stuff, but first let me talk to you about a good old Gramble. All right, hockey's over. Men's basketball's over. You still bet on WNBA, which is getting dramatic. I kind of want to just bet on Mercury games because, that's getting spicy over there. But if you're not into any of that, you can bet on tennis or golf or MMA or bet on week 1 of the Vikings. You can bet if they'll beat the Packers or where they'll finish in the division, playoff odds, stuff like that. You can find it all at betonline.net, where the game starts. There is one thing about Mike Lynn that I think proves that he's not the mark everyone really sees him as. And people kind of see him as a mark because of some stuff we'll get to. But so here's the deal. His relationship with Max Winter was weird. People give different accounts of it, and some people say that they were one thing on one day and another thing on another day. Sometimes they were, warm and very cordial, and they were best friends, and they were like father-son, and sometimes they were like the father-son from American Chopper. They were like bickering, and it was icy, and it was weird. Some Max Winter confidants say that Winter kind of didn't trust Mike Lynn, and so he was kind of always like scheming. I get like a mafia vibe, like, he's like coming for me one day kind of thing. It was weird. and it wasn't trustworthy, and it was sort of tense, but it was also like mentor mentee, just mentor mentee, but you might like come from my world one day. All of that is to set the stage for one of many dramas when it comes to the construction of the Metrodome. That is a story that might take multiple podcasts to get over because the Metrodome's construction was insane. But amidst a lot of dramas, there was a drama between Mike Lynn and Max Winter. And I don't know if y'all know about this, and if you do, good on you, but a lot of people don't. Mike Lynn absolutely pulled one over on the Vikings during this, and good on him for this. Like, he did perfectly legally and all this stuff, just like totally outmaneuvered the Vikings politically, and got a whole bunch of money out of it. But basically, here's the deal: during the negotiations for what the new stadium was going to be and where it would be, there was a lot of conflict, and the main one is, where is this thing going to be built? What city? Minneapolis wanted it, St. Paul wanted it, but they quickly kind of got ushered out, and Bloomington wanted it, and they got ushered out as well, and Minneapolis eventually wins out. And if it was going to be in Minneapolis, it was going to be an outdoor stadium, and if they brought it out to the suburbs again in Bloomington, it was going to be an outdoor stadium. So it kind of took on that, like that was the subtext, right? Is if it was going to be if you wanted an outdoor stadium, you wanted it in Bloomington. Now, Bloomington really, really wanted to keep the stadium because they were worried they would sort of fade into just being like another irrelevant suburb if they didn't have some sort of like major attraction. And that attitude, I guess, is, I think, part of why they were so eager to let them build the Mall of America on that ground after the Metropolitan Stadium was totally abandoned. But anyways, there were a lot of people very publicly pushing to keep it outdoors. And if that means we have to stay in Bloomington, then fine. But the money, the politics, and all that stuff, a lot of much more powerful people wanted it in Minneapolis. And if that's indoors, that means you're going to sell more tickets. The fans are going to be more willing to sit in a game in December if they don't have to sit in the cold. So there was business and politics reasons to keep it indoors, and therefore go to Minneapolis. And amidst all this, you have Mike Lynn, who wanted the stadium to be outdoors, and therefore wanted it in Bloomington. And he had kind of in his corner a lot of influential people, and a lot of influence. So he was making a big stink. I want this to be an outdoor stadium, and I think it should be an outdoor stadium. Meanwhile, Max Winter, who's the person like really kind of with his hand on the lever here, is getting a lot of pressure saying indoor, indoor, indoor. And Max Winter's very furious. His protege is like actively undermining him here, and it's getting totally in the way of the Metrodome's construction. And we got to get this project going. This had been a fight for 10 years. I mean, the start of the Metrodome was something that people started talking about it in 1970, and that I don't think they broke ground on it till like late 1980. So it was a decade of this, and there was a lot of pressure on Max Winter, and he was furious. And so he said, "Look, Mike, we got to figure something out here. If I can get you to come to my side and to stop pushing for an outdoor stadium, and to stop pushing for Bloomington, come to my side, and let's all be unified here. Maybe I can work something out." And somehow this got worked out with a lawyer as a mediator or something, where Mike Lynn basically got paid off he got in the contract for the development of the Metrodome 10% of all revenue from the luxury box suites. I don't know if you ever were in a box suite in the Metrodome. They were fine. I was in one time for a friend's birthday party that they held there, but it was something you could do, and it made a bunch of money, and 10% of that money went to Mike Lynn. And eventually, after Mike Lynn passed away, whoever Mike Lynn named in his will, I think his kids or something, but that money was about $1 million per year. It was real money. So a few years after the deal was struck and the Metrodome was constructed, Vikings brass was like, we got to get out of this contract. We're hemorrhaging money to this random guy for like no reason. We got to get out of this. And they never did, because it was an ironclad contract. It was really well written on Mike Lynn's side, and there was certain like legal language in there that meant that they could not get out of it the way it was worded. The only way out of it would be to get Mike Lynn to waive essentially his right to that passive income for like a lump sum, and he never agreed to that because, like, why would you? So they were just out a whole bunch of money. The only way they could get out of it was when the Metrodome itself was destroyed because the contract referenced the Metrodome and not like the Vikings Stadium. So they got out just by the virtue of getting out of the Metrodome entirely, and it nuked the contract. And so this doesn't exist for US Bank Stadium. But there you go. There is an example of Mike Lynn absolutely deftly navigating a situation for his own personal gain. And he seemed to me like somebody that just was, I'll go with opportunistic and very ambitious. And I say ambitious because Max Winter was like almost off-put by how ambitious Mike Lynn was. So I'm going to go ahead and guess that was true. But he just seemed like a very opportunistic guy that just really wanted to kind of jump on the big opportunity and, find ways to leverage things to his own advantage. And that, I think, was part of what led him to be so excited to say yes to that trade Dallas offered him in 1989. Back in the 70s, the Dallas Cowboys and Minnesota Vikings were very much adversaries. The way you would think, I don't really think of the Saints this way, but I know a lot of Vikings fans think of the Saints as our kind of like honorary other rival. Like there are a lot of people that want the Saints to lose more than they want like the Bears or Lions to lose. I don't see that way, and I kind of think that's silly, but you get what I'm talking about. Well, in the 70s, unquestionably, that was Dallas. And we were that for Dallas, too. Like, Dallas and the Minnesota Vikings met in the playoffs, like, every year. We ruined plenty of their seasons. They ruined plenty of our seasons. They were rivals. By the late 80s, Dallas was in the pits. One of the darkest periods of Dallas Cowboys history was right when Jerry Jones took over. It didn't last very long, but when Jerry Jones took over, one of the first things he did was fire Tom Landry, who he thought was like old and outdated, which is insane, right? Tom freaking Landry should have a lifetime contract, but Jerry Jones came in and the first thing he did was like, "You're out, legacy guy." There's absolutely no earned credit, and he just did it. But hey, that's Jerry Jones, right? And he brings in Jimmy Johnson, and they go 0-5 in their first year. They start 0-5. Their roster's in total shambles, absolutely in the pits. And Tom Landry took a lot of blame for the team being bad, and it turned out the team was just bad. So the Dallas Cowboys knew that they had a long rebuild ahead of them. And this was a very dark period. That roster looked something like, I don't know, what the Bears are dealing with right now. Like, it was dark. But they did have one superstar in Herschel Walker, who was a Heisman winner, face of the USFL. This was like Derrick Henry today, or pick whoever your number one running back is, right? And he was a total stud, total superstar. Remember, back in the 80s, we didn't have all that running backs don't matter stuff. Running back was probably the second most important thing next to quarterback, or at least that was perception back in the 80s, right? So the Vikings thought they were a running back away, and they had a really, really solid team. They had, going into 1989, they had Tommy Kramer, who, if he could just stay healthy, right? And Tommy Kramer had missed like 4 or 5 seasons due to injury by that point. So it really was like can he just stay healthy? And if he can, he was a super dope quarterback. But you also had Wade Wilson, who had led them to, playoff wins and stuff, led them on that 1987 thing. So they felt like pretty good at the quarterback position. You had Anthony Carter. You had Hall of Famers, Gary Zimmerman on the offensive line, a couple Pro Bowlers. Like, you had all insane defense with Dolman and Keith Millard and the dopest linebackers ever. Scott Studwell, and you still had Matt Blair and stuff. Joey Browner and Carl Lee on the secondary. You had a dope team. And they didn't have a running back, and Mike Lynn really wanted a running back. And in hindsight, you could probably have been like, hey, maybe they probably would have been fine if they just stuck with Darren Nelson. But hey, what's that? What's that ever going to get you, right? Anyways, Dallas calls around to try to see what sort of offers they can get on all of their players. And I'm talking Michael Irvin was on the block, right? Like, everybody was on the block, including Herschel Walker. Mainly, Jimmy Johnson was targeting a trade with Cleveland. He thought the Cleveland Browns were interested, and they had already had some preliminary talks. So they had that a little bit underway, and he still thought, okay, I'm going to call around to some other teams to see if I can't create a little competition here and maybe jack up the price. One of those teams is Minnesota, and when he calls Minnesota, he finds Mike Lynn desperate for a running back. Now, this is in the middle of the season. It is week 6. Cowboys are 0-5, and the Vikings started off 3-0 and lost 2 straight. So there's a little bit of pressure here. And I think Jimmy Johnson senses that because they draft up an utterly insane trade. The most complex trade in history. That's somebody joked that it was like longer than the Magna Carta. Like it was just an absolutely insane trade. Sends it over to Mike Lynn and the Vikings and says, you have to respond by 6:30. So he puts a really tight clock on it. And again, this is the ever opportunistic, the ever, excited to jump on something, right? The ever looking for a new angle and a new way to leverage things, Mike Lynn. And so he jumps on it. And I don't think Jimmy Johnson expected him to jump on it. But if you are unfamiliar with how the Herschel Walker trade went down and how what happened to the Vikings happened, it wasn't a negotiation where they say, okay, please give me 8 draft picks and we'll give you Herschel Walker. It was a lot more insidious than that. And no shade to Jimmy Johnson. I mean, good on him, right? Like, credit to you. But essentially, the way it worked was we'll give you Herschel Walker, and you give us a first rounder 2 years down the road, which is in 92, and 5 players. And all 5 of those players, one was Darren Nelson, and there were a couple, they were starters, but they weren't like key core pieces. These were Cam Bynum and KJ Osborne. These guys are not going to tip the franchise upside down if they leave, but they are plenty valuable and they're worth something, right? But Jimmy Johnson had absolutely no interest in some old role players. He wanted the draft picks. The thing about the trade is that attached to each one of those players was a conditional draft pick, conditional on cutting that player. So, hey, you get Darren Nelson. If you cut Darren Nelson, you get a second round pick in 91, that kind of thing. That was extremely exploitable if you think about it for 2 seconds. But again, there was a hurry, and Mike Lynn was champing at the bit to get somebody in, and there was a lot of pressure, and there was a clock. And I think he just blew it. I think he just kind of brain farted, and it didn't come out. So what ends up happening with this, if you think about it for 2 seconds, is, well, if they trade for Alex Stewart was the first one to get cut. Alex Stewart. And Jimmy Johnson thought Alex Stewart was lazy, and so he cut him. And he got a second-round pick for cutting him. Alex Stewart did not revert back to the Vikings. He just gets cut and becomes like a free agent or whatever. So the Vikings are now out Alex Stewart, and they're out the pick attached to Alex Stewart. They lost both things. This only dawns on Mike Lynn when Jimmy Johnson benches all of the players he traded for, even though those players were way better than whoever the Cowboys had starting. That roster was terrible, and those players were immediately some of the best players on the Cowboys, but they benched him anyways. And that sends a signal to everybody. He's going to cut them all, and he's going to get all the picks. Now it's time to panic. And this is the part that doesn't get talked about as much, is the revision of the Herschel Walker trade. Because in a panic, Mike Lynn, realizing way too late that he made a huge mistake, he calls back Jimmy Johnson and the Cowboys, and he says, okay, let's work out something different because I need to recoup a little bit. Jimmy Johnson says, all right. Darren Nelson refused to play for the Cowboys, so he got traded to San Diego. So they had 3 players left. And he said, okay, you let us keep these 3 players and the picks attached to those 3 players, and actually all the conditional picks, and we'll give you 2 third-rounders back, and the 5th-round pick we got from San Diego for Darren Nelson. That's all he was able to recoup, 2 thirds and a 5th. They lost their 1st and 2nd-round picks for 3 years running over Herschel Walker. And famously, Herschel Walker had one good debut. He had a 100-yard game and a kickoff return touchdown against the Packers in the game he came back, and then didn't have another 100-yard game until like the next season, and it wasn't very good. And they got totally destroyed in the playoffs that year, and that was kind of it. And then the Vikings roster just fell apart with no draft picks to replace it, and that brought them to this really tumultuous early 90s. 90 and 91 were like these really rough years, and not until 92 and Denny Green could they really kind of reforge an identity, and it was this total destruction of the team. But that's the Herschel Walker trade. As for Mike Lynn, yeah, he got duped on that one, but it's just a guy kind of always looking for the next big opportunity. When he resigned his position kind of in the wake of the Herschel Walker trade, he took some shares of the Vikings and became like a front office ownership executive type. He didn't last very long in that, and he eventually sold out his shares and became an executive of the World Football League, which didn't last very long. But that was kind of Mike Lynn. Now, look, Mike Lynn is, again, one of the most reviled people in all of Minnesota lore. He did the Herschel Walker trade. He was the one that didn't find replacement players fast enough, so the Vikings dropped 3 crucial games in '87. He was responsible for the Les Steckel mistake, and he swindled him out of $1 million a year. Although that last one, I think, is just kind of dope. Like, good on you, buddy. You did it. Like, I think that's kind of cool in like a Succession or a House of Cards kind of way. Like, good job. But yeah, a very reviled man, but really just a dude that was way too eager to take on some opportunities, and I think just a little bit impulsive in his decision making. But we're not exactly going to put this dude in the Ring of Honor. Anyways, tomorrow is Twitter Tuesday. Because it's June and we're kind of in the dead of everything, I figure now's the time. Ask me some stupid questions. We'll do a little themed one. Ask me the stupidest question. There's no question too dumb, whatever it is that you're like too afraid to ask because it's been. Ask me that. Nobody's looking, all right? It's June. It's the middle of the summer. Send it to me at Luke Braun NFL or at Lockdown Vikings on Twitter. You can also fill out the Google form in the show notes, or you can send me an email at lockdownvikingspodcast@gmail.com. I will see you all tomorrow for that. And as always, Skol.